A lot of people think that they are outcome oriented, but if you really ask about the outcomes, then they talk about outcomes which are not really business outcomes. It's increasingly important to say that you should only build it if you can measure it. If you can't measure it, maybe you should not build it, right? Because you're just shooting in the dark. Funding is not as easy as it used to be. Funding has dried up, both for startups as well as for big enterprises. Investors are saying that we are not sure that the return on investment on doing this is going to be better than just letting the money stay in a bank.
Sriram Narayan is the author of Agile IT Org Design, a Harvard Business Review's must-read. He is renowned for his work on the product operating model. Recently, he publishes a new book, Impact Intelligence.
So many tech digital initiatives these days, more than 50% considered failed. How this kind of problem continues to exist?
Before you start off a new initiative, if its benefits are not verifiable, it's a time to think about paying off the measurement debt you have accumulated. It's kind of speed versus accuracy, right? Like if you're shooting at a target, it doesn't matter whether you're shooting 100 bullets per minute or 10 bullets per minute if you have no idea what's hitting the target or not.
How impact intelligence can actually help the projects to succeed.
Impact intelligence is
Hello guys, welcome back to another new episode of the Tech Lead Journal podcast. Today I have the pleasure to meet Sriram Narayan. He's one of the, now ex-thought workers, but he used to be a long-time thought workers. And I kind of admired the kind of books that he wrote and the kind of things that he created, things like product operating model, agile IT organization design. So Sriram here just recently published a new book as well, titled Impact Intelligence. So when I saw the title, it kind of piqued curiosity. So today we have the pleasure to actually learn what impact intelligence is. So Sriram, thank you for your time. So welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me. A pleasure to do this here with you. I see that you have a illustrious lineup of previous speakers, so I'm honored to be on the list.
Thank you for the kind words. So Sriram, before we start our conversation about impact intelligence, I want to invite you to probably tell us some career turning points that you think we all can learn from you.
For me, joining ThoughtWorks in 2004 was a big turning point personally for me. Prior to that, I had, straight out of college, I did my engineering from a college in Mumbai. And through campus interviews, I got into IT services. That was the trend at that time. I didn't know any better. So, I went with the flow. And so the first 6 years of my career, I wasn't too happy anywhere I went. Maybe I was naive or I don't know what. So I ended up switching 5 jobs in the first 6 years or so. And ThoughtWorks was, in a way, I think it was my sixth job in 2004. My well-wishers had told me that you've already, screwed up your resume by, changing jobs so frequently. So, better stick to this one. Fortunately enough, I finally felt like, oh, okay, here is a place that I can relate to and I like the ways of working. ThoughtWorks was big into extreme programming at that time. So I was thrown into the deep end of TDD, continuous integration, mock objects, all those kinds of things. And I loved it very much. And I kind of did well in that environment. So that was a turning point because it was a bit of a risk that I was taking with my career by making yet another switch to a company. And also, Agile was very new at that time. So people had barely begun to hear about it. And so people were telling me, like, are you sure you want to leave this big brand name company to go to this company that nobody has heard of, that has an office in Bangalore and that says it's going to do this agile way of working? Are you sure you really want to do this, right? But something within me told me that, yes, this is the next thing for me, right? So I'm glad that it turned out the way it did. So that was the first one. The second one, I think, is ThoughtWorks is mainly a professional services company. But around 2008 or so, they decided to venture into software products as well. And so around 2012, I had the opportunity to move into the products division. There were 3 products. One of them was called GoCD, which eventually became GoCD. And so, I got an opportunity to go into that team, and I'm glad I took that opportunity. I initially went in as a techie, more of a developer, But then soon there was, because it was a technical product, right? So there was a opening for somebody who would look at so it was a build and development product, right? So we almost needed a roadmap on the build side of things and another product roadmap on the deployment side of things, right? So soon there opened up an opportunity to kind of own and manage the roadmap on the deployment side of things, right? So through that, I basically ended up doing a fair amount of product management, talking to new prospective customers, existing customers, industry trends, and based on all that, building up a roadmap, defending that with senior management, working with UX designers, engineers, etc., to prioritize the features and get them delivered and all that. And through that, I also saw what the state of the industry is with respect to adopting a tool like this, right? Because continuous delivery was fairly new at that time. I think Jez Humble wrote and Dave Farley, they wrote the book in 2010, if I'm not mistaken. And in 2012, we were kind of building a tool that was aligned to the book, and we were trying to, take it to the market. But we saw that the market was not at all ready to think of build and development as a single responsibility, as a single team that does build and deployment. Sorry, not development. And those are some of the experiences that led to thinking about, okay, it's not just about the technical techniques and skills, it's also the way teams are organized that matters to how well you can do these things, right? And so that kind of led me into the organization design track a little bit, and eventually ended up writing the book on agile organization design, which came out in 2015. So I think the move into studios, ThoughtWorks Studios, which was the products division, was another major turning point. And finally, the third one was when I decided that it's time to move on from ThoughtWorks and get into independent consulting. And it's partly because by then I'd been doing a fair amount of this kind of digital transformation consulting, right? Advising people about team structures, moving from projects to products and all that sort of thing. And because of my book and some other articles around that time, I started getting inbound expressions of interest from potential clients who wanted to hire me for my advice on these matters, right? However, from my employer's point of view, that wasn't always a attractive business proposition because the client just wanted me and my advice for a few months, right? Whereas the employer was in the business of selling software delivery with maybe a little bit of digital transformation advice as a front end part of that engagement. So unless it was at least a couple of $1 million worth of a deal, they wouldn't always entertain my request to support this particular request. And so I decided, okay, maybe I have moved away from the sweet spot of where the company is, and maybe I should try being an independent consultant. I was a bit nervous when I took the plunge because I did not have like a ready lineup of clients or anything like that. But I'm glad I did it because over the next 6 months to 1 year, things worked out. I'm still continuing to do my independent consulting.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing your story. I think it's really interesting, right? The first few years, you kind of like job hopping, right? Jobs to
Yeah.
jobs. I think for people who I think for me, the things that I learned is that if you are not really, clicking with your job, right? Don't be afraid to just try other jobs, right? Especially these days, I'm sure there are plenty of options that you can do until you find the right one. And you stay in Tolux for so long, and until now you become an independent consultant. So I think there are so many learnings there. This episode is brought to you by Swimm.io, and I'm excited to have its CTO and co-founder, Omer Rosenbaum, with me today to tell you more about Swimm.
Hi, Henry. Very nice to meet you, and thank you for having me.
So tell us a little bit more, what is Swimm.io?
At Swimm, we want to help companies understand their code bases. We combine static code analysis with generative AI to create comprehensive documents that help you navigate the code base. As an engineer myself, I wouldn't want engineers to spend so much time understanding existing code. I would want them to spend time creating and building new stuff. When you have code that has accumulated over decades, and especially in legacy languages that not many people are adapted nowadays, then the problem is even bigger.
Swimm.io is specializing into helping mainframe developers to understand their code base. Why mainframes?
We actually didn't start there. COBOL had been, by some people, obsolete for a few years. And I discovered that it's not really obsolete, not at all. There are more than 800 billion lines of COBOL code that are in production, and they drive lots of the business in the world. And we got more and more requests from customers to help them understand the legacy code bases that was written decades ago and get accumulated over a very long period of time.
So from your customers so far, what are some of the success stories that you can share?
So we worked with an analyst who shared with us that it took them a year to document a single mainframe application, and using Swimm they were able to document a similar application in a matter of hours. So saving that amount of time enables them to focus on other tasks.
Thanks, Omer, for sharing with us about Swimm today. To learn more about Swimm, check out their website at swimm.io. So, Sriram, let's go to the main topic for today's discussion, which is about impact intelligence, your new book, right? So maybe let's start with, what is your definition of impact intelligence and why are you writing this book?
In the book, I've defined impact intelligence as an ongoing process of collecting, analyzing, and using data to maintain a constant awareness of the business impact of initiatives, tech initiatives, business initiatives, any sort of new initiative into which the business decides to put some money in, an initiative that is kind of sort of different from the regular operations of the business, right? It's meant to change something, maybe to grow the business or to save cost or to reduce risk, anything like that. Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's very interesting, right? Because so many tech digital initiatives these days, especially during the so-called digital transformation era, right? And many of such initiatives still, statistics says, like maybe more than 50% considered failed, right? I think one of the biggest thing is because they cannot reach the intended impact, right? So tell us like how this kind of problem continues to exist and how impact intelligence can actually help the projects to succeed.
Yeah. I mean, business impact, right? So it's when people make the case for an initiative, somebody on the business side or a technology leader or a data leader or whoever it is, usually they say, okay, we think we should do this. And by doing this, it'll help us in this way, right? Essentially, when it is approved, there is an allocation of business resources, right? Whether it's team bandwidth, whether it's other kinds of hardware and software resources, or you have to run a marketing campaign, whatever it is, right? There is certainly some spend involved in the form of resources or direct money or whatever it is. And therefore, it's important to make sure that it actually translates into some kind of tangible business impact, right? And increasingly, that has become important because funding for all these things is not as easy as it used to be. Funding has dried up, both for startups as well as for big enterprises. In both cases, investors are saying like, okay, are we sure we'll get the benefits by doing this, right? And in the case of big companies, big established companies, the situation is even more dire, if I may say so, because there are many such companies where the investors are saying that we are not sure that the return on investment on doing this is going to be better than just letting the money stay in a bank or giving us back the money in some way by either by paying dividends or by declaring a buyback. All there are various kinds of things that you can do to return money to investors. And so investors are saying that we would rather have our money back today rather than, you deploying it into all these new things, which will supposedly meant to grow the business. But based on your track record, we are seeing that it's not really growing the business, right? So CEOs, COOs, CFOs, when they are in earnings calls, they are having to deal with these kinds of questions. And sometimes they have good answers, but many times I feel that their answers could do with more data, more powerful answers, right? And that's not just going to happen by preparing for an earnings call. It only happens if there is a culture of impact intelligence within the company, right? And that the muscle is already in place so that at all levels of the organization, people are constantly aware of how what I'm doing is actually translating into business impact. Right. And it's not trivial or easy to do that, but I think the more you start doing it, you'll at least find some opportunities where the linkages become clear.
Yeah, so I think what you mentioned is really interesting, right? Because these days there are a lot of things where like startups started to get these issues and getting new funds. layoffs happening as well in terms of getting to efficiency. Even the traditional big corporates these days like try to question whether the transformations initiatives that they do actually brings back the return, like what you said with the investors. So I think the key theme here is about business impact, right? So when you deploy new initiatives, digital tech initiatives, how can you actually get the business impacts? But the definition of business impact itself, first of all, I think can be quite abstract. Many people might have different ways of measuring the business impact. So in your book, you actually clearly define how do you measure business impact. So maybe let's start from there. What is actually business impact, and what are some of the maybe misconceptions people have about business impact?
Yeah, no, that's a great question as well. Thank you. Um, a lot of people think that they are outcome oriented, that they're working in an outcome oriented fashion, or their teams are outcome oriented. But if you really ask about the outcomes, then they talk about outcomes which are not really business outcomes, right? Which are a lower level outcome. And so in the book, like you pointed out, I describe a hierarchy of outcomes where I say that if you say that we delivered something or we launched something, we launched a feature, that's a delivery outcome. Yeah. Or if you say we migrated to the cloud, again, okay, that's a technology outcome, right? And that's, I'm not trying to underplay those outcomes. They are, they are good achievements. But when you're talking about business impact, they still need to translate into some kind of business impact. So at the lowest level, you have, say, technology outcomes, delivery outcomes. And then at the next level, you might have, say, the people in your product organization, they might say that, hey, this feature got great adoption, right? We have like lots of users using this feature. So feature adoption is also a kind of outcome, right? It's one step closer to business outcome, right? It's beyond delivery. Okay, you delivered and the feature got adopted, but it's still a bit away from business outcomes, right? Or somebody might say, we ran a marketing campaign and as a result, we have 1 million installations of the app. Okay, great. So that's a marketing outcome. Like, you and your product is now embedded in 1 million smartphones. Okay, great. But so what? Like, what does that mean for the business, right? So I think the closest to business outcomes are things like, okay, we have more subscriptions, or CSAT has gone up, or retention has increased, or revenue, we have greater revenue, right? Or, if you're a e-commerce business, the average order value has gone up, or the returns have come down. Those kind of things are, I think, much closer to what I call as business impact, right? And of course, you can, the ultimate, like the thing that financial metrics, of course, they ultimately translate into financial metrics like your PNL and so on, right? But even if we don't go all the way to PNL, one level short of that is revenue, cost, CSAT, all those kinds of metrics. So obviously at a technology level, when tech leaders do their work, obviously they say, okay, what we do is not going to directly translate because we are listening to what the business wants, what the product wants, and we are building things according to that, right? So we don't directly own the business outcomes. Fair enough, right? But I think there is still opportunity for all these people to work together to make sure that all their efforts jointly is, in the direction of moving the needle of the business outcome.
Yeah. So I think when you explain that, I think so many of us, maybe tech leaders or maybe even like product leaders, right? We are guilty of, explaining the kind of outcome that we produce by delivering something, right? In terms of maybe just delivery, in terms of just technology, or it could be just like product features and things like that, right? But we forgot to actually translate it ultimately to the so-called business outcome or business impact. I think the way I see it also, like maybe if I can define business outcome is like something that the investors or maybe your board of directors are interested in, right? So when you explain we just migrated to the cloud, I think those people might not be interested at all, right? But if we talk
Yeah.
about profit, maybe cost savings and things like that, they are interested in that. So maybe that's also one way to kind of like bridge misinterpretations about business outcome. So one thing about impact intelligence that you mentioned in the book, which I find really interesting for you to uncover, is that you mentioned you learn about this concept while studying, how the nonprofit, the sustainability organizations are doing it, right? And then you translate that into this impact intelligence. Like, how did you come up with this idea? Maybe tell us the story behind it so that we can also get the insights behind it.
Sure. Yeah. So as soon as I started my independent consulting, a non-profit organization in Bangalore, they reached out to me and asked me, like, what does agile mean in their context, right? So they wanted my help with that sort of a thing. And so I got involved. I started helping them out, and As part of that, my job is to also understand their space, what they do, and so as part of understanding the whole NGO space or the non-profit space, I realized that okay, over there they have to first of all obtain grants from various grant providing organizations, right? So they have to make a grant proposal, or they have to say, we qualify to get this grant from you because of our past success with various projects or because of our expertise in various areas and so on, right? So, for example, a project might have to do with, say, improving the employability of people in a particular region, right? Vocational skills and so on, right? And so there will be a field force that helps with that, right? Conducts various kinds of training, sets up the labs, all those kinds of workshops. Yeah. But before that, you have to get the grant and then you have to execute the project. And then I found that in the world of the social impact sector, they already have this in place where what they have is they have what are called as monitoring and evaluating agencies. And these agencies, they are independent agencies whose job is to monitor the impact of the project and to evaluate whether, okay, you imparted all these skills, but did it really translate into more employability? Did employment in that region go up as a result, right? And would it have happened anyway? That is the counterfactual, right? Like, were there other factors? Can we say with a reasonable amount of certainty that it is your efforts that led to the increase in employment and not just an uptick in the economy, for example, right? So I found that, okay, wow, that's quite rigorous, right? That way of thinking about things. And I saw that, oh, wow, this is already well established in the social sector, whereas we in the business sector, we often don't think about things like this, right? We just build it, launch it, and move on, and we build the next thing. So that led me to research a little more, and that's how I came across this term that they were using, impact intelligence, right? I can't remember if I also thought about that term and looked it up, and then I came across it, or was it the other way around? But nevertheless, that is how it happened.
Yeah, I find it really interesting, right? The way we actually learn from the NGO, how they actually assess, like what you said, monitor and evaluate the impact of their so-called non-profit activities, right? And then see how actually that translates to an actual, either, for example, I don't know if it's sustainability impact, right? Which sometimes are really, really hard to quantify, right?
Yeah.
But also at the same time, if we look at the tech in digital projects, right? Sometimes also it's really hard to quantify whether it is really our project that actually move the needle, right? Because there could be
Yes.
so many other things that also impact the outcome that we have. So I think all this come back to what you call impact feedback loop, right? So I think the way we actually run a particular product or project, for example, right? Sometimes we know that we have to get feedback loop, but mostly are still kind of like the technical feedback loop, the CI/CD, the TDD, and all that. Sometimes also maybe some product kind of like feedback loop, either the user adoption, the features being used and all that. But you have more feedback loops that you build inside the kind of like hierarchy that you mentioned. So tell us what is this impact feedback loop? How can we use it? And like, is there something that we should do differently now in our projects?
Yeah, like you mentioned, right? I mean, if you talk about, say, things like the agile engineering practices, then they do have feedback loops, but they are mostly like delivery feedback loops. Yeah. And even the retrospectives, the Scrum retrospectives and so on, right? They are example of potentially another feedback loop where you reflect on, the last sprint and think about how the team can, is there an opportunity for improvement in the next sprint and so on. So in one way, it's a mechanism for continuous improvement. It is also a kind of a feedback loop, right? But they are delivery feedback loops. Now, yes, like you said, in the lean startup book that came out more than 10 years ago, he popularized the phrase build, measure, learn, right? So that is also a kind of feedback loop, right? When you say build, measure, learn, product people are often quite familiar with this particular loop, right? So now in that world, right, when you say build, measure, learn, I think that is a feedback loop and that is closer to impact feedback. However, that is what I call as a proximate impact feedback loop, right? Because when they say build measure, they are measuring the proximate impact, right? So to give you an example, like I use one of these examples in the book, right? Let's say there is a big established company with a big call center or a customer contact center, right? Where there are lots of agents handling calls. And somebody comes up with the idea that, okay, if we build this AI chatbot, then maybe, more people will be served with the chatbot itself and we'll have end up not having so many calls get into the contact center, and that way we can potentially grow the business without having to grow headcount in the contact center, right? That might be the thinking. Now, if you just use build, measure, learn, then from a chatbot point of view, you might simply just measure the number of successful chatbot interactions, right? And you might try iterating based on that, right? So that's good. That's much better than simply delivering the chatbot and declaring success, right? However, in the context of the impact feedback loops that I describe in the book, we have to go beyond proximate impact to downstream impact, saying, okay, it seems like the chatbot has a good uptake, right? Like a lot of people are using the chatbot. We have this survey at the end of the chat session, and it looks like 30% of the people are saying, yes, this chat session, I got what I want out of this chat session, right? But did that really translate into call savings? It may or it may not. For example, what might be happening is they could have, maybe the users could have done the same thing using the mobile app by navigating the menus in the mobile app, right? But instead of navigating the menus, they chose to interact with the chatbot or the website. So what has happened is you just switched from one self-service channel to another, right? The total amount of self-service has may not have gone up, and therefore the call savings might have not really realized. But unless we get into this, we wouldn't know this, right? So when I talk about impact feedback loops, I'm going one step beyond the typical build, measure, learn loop to concentrate on downstream impact.
Yeah, so proximate and downstream impact, right? So I think this is crucial definition or key terms, right? So is it kind of like similar to what some people call, the output outcome or the lagging and leading indicator, those kind of thing?
It's kind of related, but if you see, I also use this in conjunction with the visual that I call the impact network, right? And the impact network is basically a map of linkages, right? Like you say, basically there is this low level metric that contributes to this next level metric, which then contributes to this another higher level metric, and so on. And there is really no limit to the number of levels you can have in an impact. It depends on the complexity of your domain, right? And it depends on how you see things in your business, right? And so because there can be several levels, right? I find this any kind of two level classification as inadequate. If somebody just says input and output, you're just talking about one link in the chain, right? But there are many linkages in that chain, right? So depending on where you want to focus, like relate to a particular context, one level is proximate, the next level is downstream. But then if you go higher up, like if you go back to this call savings example, right? So the number of successful chatbot sessions is proximate impact, and call savings really is downstream impact. But that is in this context. But you can go one level higher context and say, okay, call savings, but so what? Does that really help me control my OPEX, right? Operational expenditure. So now in that case, right, relative to OPEX, call savings is like proximate impact, and the expected downstream impact of call savings is a better contribution to OPEX, right? A reduction in OPEX. So, so that's why, I think they are related, but they are like, the terms that you mentioned, you can take any link within the impact network and apply those terms to the endpoints of that link, right?
Yeah. I think the key thing that you mentioned just now is actually the impact network, right? So this is one way actually for companies to improve their so-called impact intelligence, because if you previously just do, I don't know, like product metrics, maybe even like just project success, right? You may not have this kind of impact network, which I find can be really powerful because I don't know whether I think in all the experience in any organizations that I join, I rarely see this. Maybe mostly focus on like, I don't know, financial statements or maybe like project roadmaps and things like that. But to actually see in an organization how all things relate to each other and the kind of impact they bring until the very higher up, either like, for example, profit, revenue, and things like that, I think it's kind of missing. So tell us how to actually build this impact network for people who want to give it a try, right? Maybe we can take an example of this, chatbot or customer support domain. Maybe how can people visualize, this impact network?
Yeah, this is going to be a bit challenging to do without a visual, but I'll attempt it. So first of all, the thing to realize is the impact network is in a way, like, since this is a tech lead journal and the audience is going to be mostly techies, I think I can use this terminology and say that an impact network is basically a graph where every node in the graph represents a metric, or at least something that can be quantified. It's not a subjective description. So every node in the graph represents a metric, right? So the node is not like what you're going to do to improve the metric. No, that is not a node in the impact network. It's just these are the forces at play. These are the metrics that interplay with each other, right? So to go back to the AI chatbot example, so at the very top, I might say, okay, I have the COO wants to cut operational expenditure, and he's asked for various ideas to cut operational expenditure. So you have operational expenditure at the top of this network. And then there are many ways to do it, right? And one of the ideas that came out was, hey, maybe we can address call volume at the contact center. And maybe there is something we can do to save call volume and improve customer satisfaction at the same time, right? So that is the next level down, right? Saying, okay, if I save call volume, I'm making a potential contribution to OPEX. So that is one link. Or actually, even before that, right? You can think, okay, OPEX, customer operations is one heading of OPEX, right? So the whole cost of customer operations, customer support operations, right? And then call center operations. Then the next level down is, okay, because call center operations has fixed costs and variable costs, right? The fixed cost is all the infrastructure and other things. One of the variable cost is the call volume, because as the call volume increases, you might have to hire more people to attend to that volume, right? So that is the variable cost, but there are fixed costs. So those are like, if you go down the impact network, you have OPEX at the top. In the next level, you have one of the contributors to OPEX is cost of call center operations, right? Then the next level down, okay, that can be split into fixed costs and variable costs, right? Now, variable costs, one of the examples of variable costs is call volume, right? So now the way you try to address call volume, right, is by introducing self-service. You try to introduce various self-service channels, but each self-service channel can be an initiative in itself, right? So for example, when people call the number, they're not immediately directed to a human. There's usually some kind of a, press one for this, press two for this, and so on, right? And that is called the IVR, or the interactive voice response menu. And somebody designed that menu with a view to maximizing self-service, right? So that itself is an initiative. That is also a self-service initiative, right? So the one of the headings under call volume is this IVR. Then there are other self-service channels like your digital channels, right? But digital, again, you have the website, you have the mobile app, right? And then you could choose to go into them and do whatever you want, navigate the menus and get it done. Or you could choose to look at that chatbot icon at the bottom right or whatever and click on that and then self-service yourself through that, right? So that's a channel within a channel, but that's a separate initiative. So if you build out this tree, so you have like call volume, then there is self-service versus human service, right? And under self-service, you have all these channels. So you already built up like 4 levels in this tree or this impact network, right? At no point we have not yet discussed what are we going to do to improve this metric, right? That is separate, right? That's like you can map, you can say, okay, I've thought of an initiative and I think this initiative will contribute over here, right? That's an overlay on this network. So now coming to how to build this, right? It's usually an iterative process, right? I usually work with clients over several sessions to build it out. And it's important to get at least the relevant key stakeholders involved so that there is some consensus on what you're building, because there are many ways to imagine this and many ways to represent this, right? And we are arriving at one representation that is more or less acceptable to all the key stakeholders. And the way you do it is you can do a little bit top down, little bit bottom up, right? Start with the metrics that I'll usually talk, okay, what metrics do you anyway grapple with on a daily basis or on a monthly basis? So let's put those metrics and let's see if there are already some interrelationships between those metrics, right? Similarly, I'll say, what are the things that your execs care about, right? Let's put those metrics at the top. Let's see if there are linkages coming up, right? Then I'll ask for what is your current book of work? What are the things that are currently in play, right? And those things, those initiatives, why are you doing them? What benefits do you expect? So those metrics, have we already captured them in this picture, right? Or do we need to break down an existing metric into something else to capture the existing book of work, right? So I use a bunch of these kind of mechanisms to, some of it is inside out, outside in, bottom up, top down, right? And iterate on that a few times to arrive at. And even though you arrive at it, that is not the final version, that is like a version 1.0. And as you live with it and extend it and use it, it's going to evolve. So, there needs to be a owner for this impact network who can, maintain it on a regular basis.
Oh, thank you for your attempt, right, to kind of like visualize that in the narration kind of a way, right? So I think if people can follow, right, I'm sure it's kind of like powerful, right, the way you kind of think in terms of the metrics, right, and how they interlink with each other from top to bottom, right? And like I said, right, I rarely see these in any organization, especially in startups, right, where people just scramble and try to build initiatives over initiatives and deliver,
Yeah,
right?
that's a very good point. And I think partly the map exists in the founder's head, in the co-founder's head, and in a few people's head, right? But unfortunately, if you put them all into different rooms and ask them, give them an hour and give them a ultimatum to draw that map, you will find that they will all end up with slightly different maps. It won't be exactly the same, right? And that is where the opportunity is to say, okay, some people think that, oh, I don't have time for all this whiteboarding stuff, right? Like we got to run a business. Let's build it and ship it already, right? So, but they often don't appreciate. But I have seen that when actually I manage to get people together and do this, then at the end, often, more often than not, they feel, oh, this was worthwhile, right? We now have a shared way of looking at all of these things. And, so yeah, I would highly encourage people to, set aside, like people do so many leadership offsites, right? I think this could be a great exercise for an offsite. Like spend half a day doing this, right? And iterate on it a little bit.
Yeah, so I was laughing when you mentioned that, right? Of course, this exists in some people's head, right? Especially the board of directors or maybe the investors and all that, right? But typically, it doesn't translate down to the layers below. Like
Yes,
what you said,
yes.
the shared understanding is not there. And
Yeah.
because of no shared understanding, right, people could interpret the things that they're doing in a different way. And at the end of the day, it doesn't actually align to, making the business impact that maybe some of those people actually would have expected. Is this something similar to the concept of OKR? I know in some companies, typically in a startup who follow, like the Google way or, those big tech giants, right? Is this concept actually similar to OKR?
See, if you again take this example, right? Like the AI chatbot example. Now, the AI chatbot team, their OKR is typically framed as the key result is framed as one, it's framed in terms of delivery. Like, let's make sure we have this up and running for this product by this quarter, right? That is one key result. It's framed in terms of delivery. And to product, it's often framed in terms of number of satisfactory chatbot sessions, right? Like they say that if you have the survey at the end of the chat session, then we should have at least a 30% satisfaction score at the end of the chat session. That is how the KR is framed, right? I have not seen the KR framed in terms of downstream impact. And it's unfair also to frame the KR in terms of downstream impact, because people will say, hey, but my scope is limited. You can't give me a KR in terms of the downstream impact, right? So the key difference is OKRs are directed at individuals, whereas this is not directed at individuals. This is the downstream impact is directed at the initiative. The initiative that we have sponsored, it better have this downstream impact. You as a group ensure that the initiative has a downstream impact.
So I'm quite curious, right? Because, so many projects out there, so many things that could happen that could drive business impact. Sometimes we come up with hypotheses, okay, by doing this, we are sure that we can, move the needle in this area. But eventually, right, it's really hard to actually kind of like attribute that the things that we do actually translate to that improvement. So maybe from your actually experience, how can actually people start attributing their initiatives into the actual impact? Because there are so many variables happen, or like what
Mhm.
you mentioned, even in the very beginning with the nonprofit, could be just the economical situation that improved, and suddenly you have your metrics coming up as well. So maybe how
Yeah.
can we attribute things better?
Yeah. Well, attribution is a sort of a well-defined area. There are many cases where, people study attribution. So marketing, for example, is one domain where marketing attribution is a very, very well-known term. So for example, marketers want to understand, how to distribute their spending across various social media channels, right? How to do paid listings versus focus on content, and one channel versus another, and so on, right? And they know that, it's like in marketing, they say you first create awareness of whatever you're offering, then the user enters a period of consideration where they consider your offering, and finally it leads to conversion, right? It might lead to a conversion, or they become a, yeah. So in those things, marketing attribution is a thing where they think about, how do we know that it was whether it was the Facebook campaign that helped generate leads, or whether it was the Google campaign, or something else, and what sort of campaign, right? Like all those things. So one is to take some inspiration from how they do things. Although now that area is in a bit of a crisis because iPhone disabled the identifier for all these things, right? So they're having difficulty tracking things, and they have moved on to digital fingerprinting and all those kinds of things. So that is one. The second is they have given a couple of examples in the book about how to think about attribution, right? So for example, first of all, if you start thinking about it the right way, I think people are smart enough to find the rest of the steps. So what happens typically, if you go back to the AI chatbot example, usually, let's say there is somebody, let's talk about four different initiative leads, right? There is an initiative lead for the AI chatbot, then there is a lead for the website, and there is a lead for the mobile app, and there is somebody in charge of somebody in customer operations who's designing the IVR, the interactive voice response menu, right? Now, potentially all four of these are candidates for self-service, right? Now, typically what happens is each of them report their success individually to their respective managers or bosses, right? And so they say, they all look at call volume, they might get some data and say, oh, I can see that call volume dropped by 10% last quarter, and it must be because of what I've done, right? And there is, so more or less, they claim success on that basis to their respective managers. So effectively what has happened is all four people have claimed that 10% that they saw, right? And so if all of that were true, it should have resulted in 40% savings, right, in call volume. But that didn't happen. And there is no mechanism within the organization to reconcile this, right? So attribution is the mechanism now to say, okay, instead of asking you all to report your success individually, I'm going to do is once a quarter, I'm going to say, hey, last quarter we've observed 10% savings in call volume. Great. Congratulations, everybody. But now let's get together and decide how much of this was due to external factors, how much of it is because maybe the business is losing customers and so there are fewer people calling us, right? Um, and then how much of it is because of each of your respective efforts, and let's make a reasonable attempt to make sure it all adds up so that we have a consistent understanding of the impact of our own efforts, and so that we can decide where to spend our next round of investments on, right? So if you start thinking like this, then the other pieces will begin to fall into picture, right? Because then you can say, okay, now some of the call volume is seasonality, some of it is business growth or business degrowth, right? And then you can come up with some heuristics and formulas, etc., to start attributing components to various channels, right? It's not very scientific. Now the best way to do this is to run a controlled experiment, right? Where you say, like in the case of the AI chatbot, you say, okay, I'm going to expose the chatbot to some portion of the population and not expose it, right? And I design the experiment in such a way that everything else is well controlled for, right? And if I run this experiment, and if I'm able to repeatedly run this experiment and show that, yes, on average, when the AI chatbot is exposed, the corresponding volumes at the call centers drop by a little, that will be very good quality evidence, right? However, very often we are not in a position to run these kind of controlled experiments. Yeah, there are various reasons why, and I go into all of them in the book. Short of being able to run controlled experiments, what can you do next, right? This is what you can do next. You can do some heuristics based attribution. And the other challenge with controlled experiments is you need to have a good understanding of statistics, or you need to trust your data scientists very well to go by what they say. If they say that, oh, this experiment was underpowered and therefore we can't rely on these results, if you don't know what underpowered means, right, you still got to trust what your data scientist is saying, right? Or if they say that, oh, the effect size is not good enough, or some other terminology like that. And typically what happens is the business is not well versed with this, right? So there's often a bit of, as long as the data scientists say what matches the business's intuition, everything is well and good. Otherwise, people don't really accept those observations, right? Whereas attribution is, I think, a simpler process. It's a more approximate process, but it's a simpler process, and it helps build the muscle in this area, right? Build the muscle to think about this way and to get more rigorous. And maybe then at a certain point, you'll be ready to listen to what the data scientists have to say.
Yeah. So I think that's really a very good example, right? Especially when you mention, the four initiatives all claim the same kind of impact, at the business level, right? Simply because people don't have all these attributes or maybe variables, that they measure. When people claim, right, you can't really attribute it. So I think all this comes back to having good measurement, maybe good analytics, and maybe good thinking in the first place, right? When you actually have the initiatives, right? When you plan the initiatives, to kind of like know what things to measure, right? Or what levers that might move because of certain things. And I know in many organizations, this capability might not be there. Is it something that as a, I don't know, like digital product team or maybe the organization, they should also build this kind of capability?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think it's increasingly important to say that you should only build it if you can measure it. If you can't measure it, maybe you should not build it, right? Because you're just shooting in the dark, so to say. But what happens usually is that when I'm pitching for, like, if I'm pitching to build this AI chatbot, right? I'm only asking for money to build the AI chatbot. I'm not asking for money to build all the surrounding measurement infrastructure, so that because I might have to get a new report from the call center to prove that there is a change in data volumes, right? In call volumes. But that is customer operations, it's a different department. Maybe it's handed off to a vendor or something. So, my team cannot build out that report, right? We don't have the knowledge, we don't have access to those systems, and so on. So it's difficult to start building all the necessary measurements in the context of my initiative. And that's where I recommend that before the initiative is green lighted, the people who are responsible for saying, okay, let's go ahead with this, they should say, do we have the measurements in place? If not, can we wait a bit and ask the appropriate teams to develop those measurements, right? And then let's go ahead and start building this, right? So there are multiple ways to do this. One of the ways I've suggested in the book is for the execs, the COO and the CFO. In a way, I've targeted this book at a COO, CFO audience because I feel they are the people with the authority to do these things. Like if you want to create a measurement improvement program, right? No business leader is going to ask for it. And a technology leader is already asking for various things for tech modernization. So they are not going to ask for a measurement improvement program, right? But it's the people who are signing the check who need to know that what is the return I got for this, right? So they are in the best place to sponsor this program. And then if you have this program in place and a team in place to build out measurements wherever there are gaps, and then when any new proposal comes, you can say, okay, what is the benefit you're promising? Are you sure? Are these benefits verifiable, right? Through what measurements? Do we have those capabilities in place today? If not, can we build them first? Assuming that, yes, in principle, we are deciding we want to do this, but we don't want to start this tomorrow. We want to first build the measurements, make sure that things are verifiable, and then go ahead, right? If the gap is very small, maybe the team itself can do it, right? So if it's just about building a dashboard on top of some existing base metrics, sure, the team itself can do it. But if there are some basic gaps, then you need something like the measurement improvement program and get them to, in a way, so, I say pay off the measurement debt, just like we pay off technical debt, right? Like we might be rushing towards the release, so we just build something, get it out. But then before we start work on the next release, we say, let's pay off the technical debt, right? So similarly, right, before you start off a new initiative, if its benefits are not verifiable, it's a time to think about paying off the measurement debt you have accumulated in that area, right? And then go about your business.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning about measurement debt. When I read that part, I also like it, right? Because we
Yeah.
all know about technical debt, but actually measurement debt is equally important, if not more important, because you can quantify in terms of business impacts and all that, right? So measurement improvement program, you mentioned this term, right? And actually it's part of this thing called iRex framework, right?
Yeah.
So for organizations that want to improve their impact intelligence, they can adopt this iRex framework. So tell us in high level, what is iRex framework? How can people start using them to actually, build their impact intelligence?
Yeah. So the iRex framework is just a way of tying together all these recommendations into a framework with different modules so that, it's hard to adopt all of these at one go. So I've kind of split it into 8 different modules. And 3 of those modules are introductory modules. You can start with any of them in the beginning. So one of them, for example, is called impact visualization. And that is the module through which you build out the initial version of the impact network, right? What we just discussed. Then there is a module called the demand management module, which is really about asking for better justifications for what you're going to build, right? If somebody says, let's build this because by doing this, we are going to improve CSAT. Oh, that is not a great justification because how do you know that CSAT improved because of what you did, right? So CSAT is a far away metric. okay, you articulated downstream impact, but you also need the proximate impact. So can you articulate what you're going to do in terms of its proximate impact and in terms of its downstream impact? Can you talk about, not just talk about we are going to improve CSAT by how much, in what time frame, under what assumptions and dependencies, right? You provide better justifications for what you're doing. So that is part of the demand management module. And then, even before we get into this whole impact attribution, saying who contributed how much, if there is no such culture in the organization, the initial step is just impact demonstration, right? Just like we do showcases in our delivery work, right? But can you do a post release showcase and demonstrate the impact, right? It's a different matter whether the impact is less than or more than what was expected. We'll come to that later, right? But just demonstrate the impact and the learnings and so on, right? So that is the impact demonstration module. And then when you come to impact attribution, that's where I call it the contribution analysis module, where you analyze the contribution coming from different sources, internal factors as well as external factors, and try to make sure that they add up. But to do that effectively, you need to have the measurements in place, which is why you have the measurement improvement program. And then there are the advanced stages where once you've done all this, you can actually go to, for example, deviation analysis. The deviation analysis is what is the deviation between the expected impact and the actual impact? And what is the reason for those deviations, right? It's meant to be a learning exercise, right? Because sometimes an initiative is okayed only because it promised, say, a 15% uplift. Okay. Had it promised a 10% uplift in the beginning, maybe it would not have been prioritized because 10% is not good enough, right? Now, what happens at the end if when you actually check? What if it turns out that no, the impact was actually only 9%, right? So if we knew this at the beginning, we would not even have prioritized this, right? So it's not about, it's not for beating up anybody or anything, but to learn that in future, how can we, like, just like we talk about getting to better estimates for our, developer stories and so on, right? Like you estimated it to be a 3 pointer, but it took a month to deliver this feature, right? So similarly, if you estimated something at 15% uplift and it only ended up being a 9% uplift, what can we learn from that, right? And how can we do better? And then out of all this process, you can report a couple of metrics. One of the metrics, I call it as the benefits realization ratio, which is simply the ratio of actual benefit to expected benefit. So if the actual uplift was 9% and the expected uplift was 15%, so you have 9 by 15, which is like what, 3 by 5, right? So 60%. 60% is your benefits realization ratio. So this gives you a way of a rudimentary way of comparing across initiatives, saying, okay, this initiative fulfilled 60% of its promise, whereas this other initiative fulfilled 80% of its promise. It's a kind of a say-do ratio, if you're familiar with that term, right? But that doesn't mean necessarily depend. Sometimes fulfilling 60% of your promise on a CSAT metric might be more valuable than fulfilling 100% of your promise on some other metric, right? So there are a few metrics that go together to understand what's really going on and to help us make better investment decisions in the next round, right? So all this put together is what I call the iRex framework, and you can go about adopting it very gradually. In fact, I've been fortunate enough to have clients who are willing to try this in different ways. And I've had cases where one client started off with impact in visualization, another started off with the demand management module, and the third actually started off with the impact demonstration module, right? So, and that's how I kind of came to suggest all three of them as potential starting points, depending on where you are and what your priorities are.
Right. For those listeners who are interested in diving deep into this iRex framework and all the modules inside, right? I think you can check out Impact Intelligence book. I find the concepts really, really interesting, right? Especially even though just starting from the beginner modules, right? The 3 beginner modules, I think we can all reap benefits just by following that. And obviously, I can't, conceptualize the advanced modules yet because I have yet to be involved in those kind of initiatives. But I think it can be really powerful, especially like what you mentioned, for the COO and CFO out there who sometimes question, like, you spend so much money and you kind of like spend so many resources. Is it really bringing the true benefit, right? So I think do check it out. And one last question that I have about all this impact intelligence. I know these days, organizations try to prioritize speed of delivery, right? And, they come up with so many initiatives, try to deliver as fast as possible. At the same time, your impact intelligence also advocate people to start measuring business impacts more accurately. So how can we balance between this speed of delivery and also, knowing the outcome or the impact that we are building by those initiatives?
It's kind of speed versus accuracy, right? Like if you're shooting at a target, it doesn't matter whether you're shooting 100 bullets per minute or 10 bullets per minute if you have no idea what's hitting the target or not, right? So, and impact intelligence is about gaining that idea what's hitting the target, right? And is it hitting the bullseye or the second ring or the third ring, or it's just flying out, right? Today, unfortunately, at least in terms of downstream impact, we have very little idea, right? There are few companies like Amazon, they are very good at this. They have teams of econometricians who develop models like this, and they're very good at this. And I'm sure there are many other tech companies that are good at this. But the vast majority of what I call the classic enterprise, right? The established businesses, who've been there, who are brick and mortar and so on, right? They lack this. And therefore, I would say, I'm not sure if there is much of a balance to be struck at all, right? If between speed and accuracy, I think you got to get accuracy right first. And then as you practice, speed will improve, right? Whereas if you focus on speed first without any idea of accuracy, right, then it's busy work. You're doing lots of things. Oh yeah, right. We're churning out. That's what a feature factory is in some ways, right? Churning out features, but we don't know. And it kind of goes back. If you do all this, the more you churn out, the more you have to maintain and keep running, right? So your run costs keep going up year on year. And given the same budget, if more goes to run, less is available for building new things, or you have to keep asking for more, an increase in the budget, which is going to come with more questions like, okay, what did I get for what you spent last year? So I think the speed versus delivery conversation is speed versus measurements. People should not have too much trouble trading off speed for measurement, right? It's a bit like the WIP concept that we talk about in lean, right? Work in process or work in progress, right? Start less and finish more, right? But I have a newer definition of finish. Finish is not just delivery, finish is impact, right? Start less and finish more in terms of show more impact, right? And so maybe extend the definition of WIP to the impact level, not just the delivery level.
Right. I like the way you kind of like use the analogy of, shooting and, but if you shoot not in accurate way, also it's kind of like waste. That kind of like reminds me also this speed and reliability thing in, the DORA metrics, right? So it may not be a trade-off, right? So if you improve both aspects, you can actually become a much more high-performing organizations altogether. So Sriram, thank you so much for this conversation. I think we can all learn a thing or two about using business impact intelligence to actually improve our delivery. But as we reach the end of our conversation, I would like to ask you this one question that I always ask my guests at the end. I call them the 3 technical leadership wisdom. So if you think of it just like advice, maybe if you have the version of wisdom you can share with us today.
This is a tough one for me. I've been thinking about it, and well, in the context of this topic, maybe it's a bit unimaginative, but what I can say is in the context of this topic, the sort of obvious takeaway wisdom is that, like, when I was a developer, right, I used to run behind the shiniest tech stack, the hottest new tech stack, and doing all the cool technical things and all that, right? But then it's kind of obvious from our discussion that what I'm going to say is that impact matters more than how hot the tech stack is that they're working on, right? But sometimes, yeah, developers might feel from their own personal interest point of view that, oh, this tech stack is going to look good on my resume, right? Whereas the business impact may not be so much at a junior developer level, right? But as you progress in your career, it changes, right? So unless you're aware of this dynamic, right, we might get into the trap of always chasing the coolest tech stack, versus at some point in your career, as you progress, you got to shift your balance towards the impact side of things, and start talking more and more about impact and being able to articulate it and being able to think about your technical decisions in that light, right? So yeah, those skills, the more we gain, I think it'll be better for us in our tech career progression, right? So I'm afraid I don't think I have three, but I'll leave you with this one.
Yeah. So definitely very, how should I say, very reflective, right? So because all techies out there, I'm sure we all like to chase cool technologies, new trendy technologies. AI might be the buzzwords this day, right? But don't forget, there's always the impact that you have to kind of like prove or demonstrate, right? Before you can actually think that the technology adoption is a successful one, right? So, Sriram, if people love this conversation, they want to talk to you more, ask you about impact intelligence or any other things, right? Is there a place where they can reach out online?
Sure, yes. I mean, you can connect with me on LinkedIn or Blue Sky. And you could go to get my handles, you could go to my book website, which is www.impactintel.net. So that's Intel with a single L, impactintel.net. Or you could email me at sriram@agileorgdesign.com. So that's happens to be the book website for my earlier book, Agile Org Design. So yeah, it was yeah, and I would look forward to further interactions with people who have listened to this and who want to have a follow up chat or something. So thank you very much for setting this up, for having me here, and it was I enjoyed this conversation very much.
Right. It is my pleasure to have you in the show. So, thank you so much for spending your time and explaining about impact intelligence. So, thank you, Sriram.
You're welcome. My pleasure.